Stay with us. Leigh Sales is next with 7:30.
Welcome to the program. Australia's increasing cost of living will be front of mind when voters head to the polls for the federal election this year. Inflation has come roaring back into the economy after years of sitting well below the Reserve Bank's target. Inflation's basically how much things cost. During the next 2 nights, Alan Kohler examines the tricky situation Australia finds itself in, increasing prices for essentials, but wages barely moving, debt levels sky high, and supply problems caused by global events and natural disasters.
Australia is getting its first bout of proper inflation in 40 years. Inflation measures the cost of living, and while the official stats aren't fully showing it yet, most of the everyday things we buy are starting to get more expensive.
The cost of living at the moment is absolutely exorbitant.
When there's been high inflation overseas, there's been high inflation in Australia.
Groceries that 2 years ago would cost me around $100 a week and now around $140 to $150 a week.
The pressure on household budgets is made worse by the unprecedented amount of debt we're in, and wages growth is still slow. It looks like we're now entering a new era of high inflation, and the economic rules we've gotten used to are being rewritten.
I think the time for sort of widespread spending without considering the consequences is very much over.
Inflation is simply rising prices calculated by statisticians using a basket of things that you and I normally buy. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, economists were arguing about whether the burst of global inflation caused by the pandemic would be temporary or more lasting. But the surge in commodity prices, especially oil, is reminding us of the 2 oil shocks of the 1970s and the so-called Great Inflation that resulted.
There is now probably no commodity more crucial than oil.
And now there are calls to cut the petrol excise tax, which was actually introduced by the then Treasurer John Howard in 1978 during those oil shocks. 3.5 cents a litre it was then, taking the price to 21 cents. Those were the days, but petrol is still fundamental and it still really hurts and flows through to everything.
I always like to use the analogy that ballooning is like a metaphor for my life, which is that I just blow with the wind, destination unknown.
We're going to start the inflation process.
After 315 days affected by restrictions, Kif Saunders' ballooning business is coming out of the pandemic into a turbulent economy.
So running a small business, every dollar counts. And so any rising cost is going to have an impact in our business. Fuel's now nearly $2 a litre. I mean, of course this is going to have a massive impact. Price of gas, price of insurance. I mean, costs are going up. In a really volatile consumer market, it's very tricky to take that brave step to be raising your prices. We still haven't had a great chance to be able to determine what that price point is to meet the rising costs that we're currently experiencing, given the current economic situation. At this stage, we have a far bigger kind of, objective, which is just survival.
Like many small business owners, he wants to raise wages, but it's tricky timing.
I owe these people a lot in the sense of what they have given to this company and to me. And they're friends. The cost of living is going up and they deserve it. But obviously, running a business, it still comes down to the fact that people accept that you're going to have to pass this on because, you can't absorb all of these costs. Now, I've completely accepted that if this business breaks even over the next year, then that's actually a great result. And so these times, they're tough, but, It is destination unknown, and I'm happy to roll with that.
As costs continue to increase, people are looking to save. Down at Queen Victoria Market, consumers are cutting out the middleman and buying direct from suppliers. But even their costs are going up. Con, what sort of wholesale price increases have you seen?
Quite substantial, I've got to say. We're looking around about 20%.
Do you have to absorb these price increases, or are you passing them on?
Up until now, we've certainly absorbed them, but we can only hold on for so long.
And what are the costs you're seeing going up the most?
Well, the cost of getting product here is a huge factor.
This is transport?
Transport, yeah. Everything has gone up.
Inflation last year was 3.5%, which might sound okay, except that wages increased by 2.1%. Also, it depends what you buy. Vegetables increased by 6.1%. Beef and veal prices increased by 8.1%. Oils and fats, 5.4%. And automotive fuel, 32.3%. Everybody's inflation is different.
We've seen global demand for goods and services rise post-pandemic. You know, households were locked away, couldn't spend money, we saved a lot, we've come out spending. But when demand outstrips supply, issues start to emerge. 50% of businesses reported that supply-side shortages are impacting their businesses, and 40% of those said that increased prices as a response.
The cost to move our product to our retailers has gone up significantly, and we're also seeing wheat prices go up. You know, it's the last resort that we push our prices up to our consumers. But on baked beans and spaghetti, canned tomatoes and canned fruit, we expect prices of over 10% on shelf to be going up, unfortunately, in about 12 weeks' time.
Former Australia Post CEO Christine Holgate now heads logistics network Toll Global.
By far, fuel prices are a massive cost for us. So if those fuel prices do start to surge, like they're predicted to do so, that will be passed on. Here in Australia, we've had 3 months of terrible weather, and that's impacted rail, it's impacted roads, and of course air. And undoubtedly, the costs have gone up.
What do you think the impact of higher inflation is going to be?
My biggest concern at the impact of inflation is the increase in poverty that could follow.
I'm an enrolled nurse. After tax, I get about $1,900 in my hand. I haven't been able to continue to keep up with the cost of living, regardless of working full-time. I work weekends as well, and it still doesn't cover everything that I need.
Single mother Julie Marie hasn't seen her pay rise in real terms for 4 years due to a historic public sector wage freeze in WA. The state government is set to scrap the wage cap, but that's not helping Julie yet.
My expenses here in this house have actually gone up about $300 a fortnight over the last 12 to 18 months. I haven't actually bought my children's school clothes this year at all. Somehow I have to be able to afford to buy them an entire new winter wardrobe. My children have ADHD and they've also got ASD. 2 days ago I had to pay $125 for 3 scripts for them. My biggest worry really is just not being able to afford to continue paying rent. There is no getting ahead without a pay rise. The government should be able to give us enough money to be able to survive on. Give us a decent pay rise that actually works in this world today. So I'm terrified of what's going to happen.
Wages haven't been rising for years. They're starting to now, but not fast enough. And price inflation without income inflation means most people fall behind. Now, the way to get wages up is by driving unemployment down, which is now largely happening because immigration disappeared during the pandemic.
In terms of inequality and who's going to be impacted by rising inflation, it is going to be low-income households and it's going to be households on fixed incomes. That goes up, I think, to a structural issue with the wages setting in Australia. We saw that coming into the pandemic. We had 10 years of really low wages growth, despite strong economic growth. And we're seeing now, coming out of the pandemic, those wages just aren't coming back, the strength that we would expect, particularly with unemployment where it is.
Will wages growth be enough?
Wages growth will go up and inflation is going up, but our view is that in the short run, inflation is going to be higher than wages growth. And that means that for a lot of workers, they're going to experience a real pay reduction.
Does that mean that households are going to go backwards for 12 months?
No, I wouldn't refer it to as going backwards, because a lot of them are sitting on a lot of savings and they'll probably just use some of those savings.
The only outfit with the job of controlling inflation is the Reserve Bank, and the only tool they've got is lifting interest rates. But that does nothing about oil prices or supply chain disruptions. It just slows down demand, often by causing a recession. How high can inflation go, do you think?
It depends a lot on how long the crisis in Ukraine obviously lasts, because petrol prices are going to be a big part of that story. But I think we should brace ourselves and expect to see certainly inflation above 5% and probably edging up to 6%. Will it go as high as we expect to see, for example, in the US, where now they're forecasting over 10%? Probably not.
Professor Warwick McKibben sat on the RBA board during the GFC. He knows the delicate balancing act it's facing amid the new economic environment.
The worst thing a central bank can do in a supply shock or an oil crisis is to target inflation, because by targeting inflation you push downward pressure on the real economy to stop the other relative prices from rising. So you're trying to isolate the oil effect from the rest of the economy. That's a very bad monetary policy.
Well, because you'd be causing a recession just because there's a problem getting supply.
That's right.
How likely do you think there's going to be an oil shock?
There is an oil shock. I mean, already there's an oil shock, but it's not just an oil shock. Between them, Ukraine and Russia produce about 30% of global wheat production. So we're seeing agricultural prices, food prices already rising, energy prices rising 30-40%. But look forward, what are the key issues that are going to be facing the Australian economy over the next 20 years? It's not demand shocks coming from the 70s experience. It's climate change, it's oil shocks, it's a whole range of issues. And one of the big ones actually is the amount of debt.
Professor McKibben is right. Australians have more household debt now than during any other time in history. In fact, we have some of the highest levels of debt in the world. That means the interest rate balloon won't have to go very high at all to bring the economy back to earth.
That story was produced by Kirsten Robb, and a full statement from the West Australian Government about the public sector wage freeze can be found on our website. Full disclosure also regarding Alan Kohler. As well as working for the ABC, he writes columns for the New Daily, which is financially backed by industry super funds, and he's also editor-in-chief for a newsletter, Eureka Report, owned by InvestSmart. In part 2 tomorrow night, we take a look at what could happen with interest rates.
The Australian dream of home ownership has turned into a nightmare of debt.
I'm nervous about interest rates going up.
The household sector in Australia carries a lot of debt, and the Reserve Bank is going to get a lot of mileage out of rates going up.
We'll have to adjust our budget. It's not an if or a but.
If they overcorrect, things could go south pretty quickly for a lot of families.
It's going to be a guess. Let's hope they guess right.
Politicians from across the political spectrum gathered today to farewell Labor Senator and factional warrior Kimberly Kitching. As well as triggering widespread grief, her death has exposed the underbelly of Australian politics. Here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle.
Kimberly Kitching was a loved wife, daughter and friend. She died suddenly just over a week ago, aged just 52. Today she was farewelled at Melbourne's St Patrick's Cathedral.
But Kimberly's view of friendship and of love was all in and absolutist.
Kimberly Kitching was also a senator in the Australian Parliament who had made a significant impression in her relatively short time in the upper house. She has been remembered in the past week for her assertive work on human rights and on upgrading Australia's sanctions regime. And she was not just a member of the Australian Labor Party, but a powerful factional warrior in her own right, in the particularly fraught world of the Victorian right. These different aspects of Kimberly Kitching's life have come together since her death in what has appeared to be an unseemly public mix of very real grief and anger at her death, interwoven with political, factional manoeuvring and retribution. There has also been anger that the media has been covering this story, even before Kitching's funeral. This was seen as disrespectful to her family.
I've got to say I think this is an unfortunate discussion to have 2 days before a funeral of someone.
But those who argue the media shouldn't be covering this story misunderstand that the story has been driven by the very family, friends and allies who are closest to her. Among them is former long-serving MP Michael Danby, who spoke to 730 with the permission of Kitching's husband, Andrew Landernew.
She was a strong woman, a deep friend, passionate, whip-smart intelligence, spoke 5 languages, a cosmopolitan Aussie girl who ruffled some feathers but always in a cause.
2 separate issues concerning Kitching have been at issue in the past week: her stalled pre-selection and her icy relationship with some of her Senate colleagues. Both are claimed to have added to the stress she was under in the lead up to her death, but both are equally now disturbingly entwined with power plays.
Admit the senator.
Kitching was nominated by Labor in 2016 to fill what is known as a casual vacancy, left when former Minister and factional power broker Stephen Conroy left the Senate for the private sector.
I swear that I will be faithful.
It was a captain's pick by her close friend and factional ally, the then leader Bill Shorten. Kitching was far from a political novice. She worked for the controversial arm of the Health Services Union, scrutinised in 2014 by the Trade Union Royal Commission, and had a solid base of union support. She had worked as a political staffer and a Melbourne City Councillor. She was deeply embroiled in the particularly internecine wars of the Victorian right faction, where friendships were made and unmade over decades. Those power struggles often went spectacularly bad.
The Victorian Labor government has lost a 3rd minister in the...
Allegations of branch stacking in 2020 by another sub-faction of the Victorian right led to the operations of the Victorian branch being suspended and the affairs of the party in the state being taken over by the federal executive.
Premier Daniel Andrews requested the intervention, the first in 50 years for Victoria.
There were beneficiaries of that, basically the socialist left and its small group of allies in the right, the Miles Conroy SDA group. And that meant that Kimberly's pre-selection was dangled over her head for a year.
To be clear, Michael Danby is sheeting the responsibility for the delayed pre-selection directly to other parts of the Victorian right, and specifically to Richard Miles, the deputy leader of the Parliamentary Labor Party, and to Stephen Conroy, who remains a power broker even though he has long left the Parliament. 730 put this to Richard Miles and Stephen Conroy. Miles declined to respond. Conroy did not respond.
We can't say what caused her death, but we can say that here was a strong woman with her own faction who normally would have 45% of the Labor Party wanting her to be pre-selected for the Senate. Because Labor was suspended, she didn't have that support. Being marginalised in Canberra.
The anger isn't just about Kitching's stalled pre-selection. Kitching took her own path in the Parliament. She made her mark in political attacks in Senate estimates hearings, sometimes controversially, including by opening the way for the government's attack on Australia Post Chief Executive Christine Holgate. But it was on policy issues, particularly when it came to China, where she really ruffled feathers.
Kimberly's views on foreign policy were more hawkish than the conventional wisdom in Canberra. You can see that on the inquiry into the Uyghurs. You can see that in the way she pushed for this Magnitsky human rights legislation.
Kitching had also made friends across the political divide, to a point where she was regarded with suspicion by her colleagues. They thought she regularly leaked against the man who had replaced her friend as leader, against the party and against them.
Bill Shorten, I think, described her as a political warrior.
She was a warrior, and she played politics hard too. But one of the things she was concerned about in the Labor Party, and she raised with me, is that you and Christina Keneally would be weak on China.
These tensions boiled over in 2019 when Kitching was urging a Senate tactics meeting not to back a Greens motion on climate protests. Labor Senate leader Penny Wong reportedly said to Kitching, "Well, if you had children, you might understand why there is a climate emergency."
My motivation in that exchange wasn't to personally attack her. My motivation was to express the distress that many children feel about climate change. But what I said was insensitive. You know, I regret it. And I apologised as I should.
But things really came to a head last year during the white-hot politics of the Brittany Higgins story.
I was told by one of your senators 2 weeks before about what you were intending to do with the story in my office, 2 weeks before.
Oh, I had no knowledge of this.
No one had any knowledge.
Okay. I had no knowledge of this.
How dare you?
Order. Now we will
it's
move.
All about protecting yourself.
The result was that Kitching was dumped from the Tactics Committee, a move her friend said occurred without her being given an opportunity to defend herself. Kitching said she was being bullied. Her Senate colleagues deny this.
Penny's a lawyer. She knows about natural justice. Accusing people of working with the Liberals without being able to put their case is, just not fair.
Politics is a rough business, but the allegations swirling in the wake of Kimberly Kitching's death raise complex questions of where rough and tumble ends and bullying begins, and about the role gender plays in perceptions of these things. Would a male politician being dumped from a tactics group because he was suspected of leaking be regarded as bullying? Would his colleagues be referred to as mean boys? On the other side, given the debate about the treatment of women in politics, should Labor's leadership have done more to address Kitching's documented complaints about her treatment? And could some form of inquiry help resolve these questions?
And what happened to her was beyond the normal argy-bargy of politics. She complained to the deputy leader. Was that passed on? She complained to the workplace group. Was that passed on? Albo could simply stand up and say to the family, "We're sorry. We did the wrong thing."
Always lurking in the background of this story is real politics. An election campaign is only weeks away. This is a story of factional warfare underneath a human story. If it continues to play out in public, it could damage the prospects of the party that all those involved claim to love.
I don't think it would have happened if she was still the offsider of Bill Shorten and Bill Shorten was leader.
I believe that Kimberly would want everyone in her Labor family to channel their grief, to gather their strength and move onwards from here.
As the Labor Party publicly confronts its factional warfare, at the same time it's hoping the weekend's state election result in South Australia is an omen for what may be ahead federally. Labor's Peter Melinauskas is now the new South Australian Premier. He's with me from Adelaide. Premier, congratulations on winning the election.
Thanks very much, Leigh.
In your acceptance speech, you said that you wanted to lead a government focused not just on the next 4 years, but on the next generation. Long-term benefits often require short-term sacrifice and pain. Are you going to have the guts to square with South Australians about the kind of short-term sacrifices you might need them to make for the next generation?
No, I don't think that they do necessarily have to make substantial sacrifices. They just need a government that has got the courage to jettison short-term politics with a focus on the long term. What they need is a government that is willing to make it very clear at an election, in the lead up to it, there is a big policy agenda that might not deliver something to them in the next 3 or 4 years, but will have a benefit in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And I had that message throughout the entirety of our campaign, and the electorate has overwhelmingly decided to respond to it positively. And I think one of the reasons we're able to achieve that is because of the moment that we're living in, Leigh, where in the post-pandemic world, I think there is an aspiration amongst the Australian community, including here in South Australia, that the legacy of COVID is more than just a bad memory and a big debt. And I think that it allowed us to achieve the result we did on the weekend.
Health services were a big issue in the campaign. Serious problems in things like health systems don't just emerge overnight. Labor's been in power in South Australia for the best part of 2 decades. Don't the seeds of the under-resourced health system come from Labor's time in power? And so therefore, how can the public trust that you're the people to fix it?
Well, they've decided to invest in their confidence us to fix the health system because we had a plan that we took to the election. There was a difference between us and our political opponents. They were, I think, focused more on the blame game and trying to blame the former government for its actions. And I just said, look, here's our plan. Please endorse it and we'll enact it. That's what we're doing. But having said that, Leigh, throughout the entirety of our campaign, in fact, throughout the entirety of my leadership of the party, I've said the former Labor government did some good things, but it did some wrong things too. And you can't be proud about what you did right without being honest about what you did wrong. And I admitted the failings of the former Labor government in health. We won't be repeating those mistakes of the past, but we're not focused on the past. We're focused on the future, and we've got a very clear plan about increasing capacity within the system. But as a question for our federation more broadly, I do think there are live issues at play about the nature of our health funding agreement between the states and the Commonwealth, and that is worthy of review. And I'll certainly be using my position as Premier to advocate in that area.
Are there any other particular issues that you, as South Australian Premier, want to put on the table nationally?
Look, there will be others. I think the way our GST share operates is something that is worthy of thorough examination. My predecessor largely endorsed a proposal that took GST share away from South Australia and saw the West do better. That's not in my state's interests. But the big one, of course, is health. The idea that we've got this current situation where the funding agreement sees primary health care with the Commonwealth and, of course, hospital care and responsibility with the states, and the two working against each other, doesn't make any sense for patient outcomes, let alone for the taxpayer. So I think that is something that needs to be elevated around the National Cabinet agenda. I know it has already been raised by the Victorian Premier, and I very much look forward to the opportunity to add my contribution to that important discussion and debate.
South Australians know you. People around the country are now going to get to know you a little bit more. And so I wanted to ask a couple of questions around that. There's a famous Australian biography called A Fortunate Life by a man called A.B. Facey. And by modern standards, he actually had a very hard life, but he viewed it as a very fortunate life. Is it fair to say that you've had a fortunate life? And how do you relate to people who've not had it as fortunate as you?
Leigh, there is absolutely no doubt about the fact that I count myself as a very lucky man. I grew up in a very much a middle-class household with loving parents who did everything for their kids and had the ability to do that. I'm very lucky to have 3 healthy children and an amazingly supportive wife. When I think about our crazy juggling act at home, trying to balance my responsibilities, my wife's career and raising our children, I think about single parents that are out there that are trying to do all of that, but only on one income and only one guardian or parent. That's tough. And you could say that about any other demographic or any other family in a different environment. And I just think it's incumbent upon those who are elected to high office to think about other people's experience through their prism rather than your own. And I devote myself to that cause, namely by spending as much time with people as I reasonably can, and that's a pattern I intend to maintain in my new role.
Has life ever thrown you a real backhander?
Oh, look, of course, in my role in the former Labor government as a minister, there were very substantial challenges. But each of us in our lives have to confront various difficult circumstances. But let me be honest with you, Leigh. I don't profess to have a hard luck story. I've been blessed with a lot of opportunity in my life, but certainly my family history has dealt with very substantial backhanders, to use your term, and they, through resilience and commitment and opportunity, have been able to provide me with an amazing opportunity. But they always were at pains to ensure that whatever opportunity I'm blessed with, I used to help empower others and allow and I believe in using the power of government to provide opportunity to those who otherwise haven't been as fortunate.
I would imagine that your grandparents who fled Europe at the end of during the Second World War would be thrilled and amazed to see what their grandson has been able to achieve. Congratulations, Premier. We look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
I love that, Leigh. Thanks a lot.
That's the program for tonight. Thanks for your company. Good night.